So welcome to the panel, this afternoon's panel, book Material Transformations. Conference in Books in Motion, Material Transformations of Books in Motion. Our first speaker today is Bilal Orfali. Bilal is an associate professor of Arabic Studies at the American University of Beirut and previously held the M.S. Sophia Chair in Arabic Studies at the Ohio State University. His research is part of a rebirth of interest in philology in the field of classical Arabic literature. Imagining philology as more than the production of authoritative editions, it explores the dynamic literary culture that produced these texts, exploring the complex nexus of relations in the fields of Quranic studies, theology, Sufism, history, adab, philosophy, lexicography, and grammar. Thanks. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. I also would like to thank the organizers, Sonia, of course Hala, and James. The research that I'm presenting today, my title is The Maqamat of al-Hamadani Manuscripts Collection and Early History. I presented on this in Berlin, in the US, and at the UK, and I always keep the title, but every time I talk about different aspects of the research. Because this is an ongoing research, it's a book project, and my publisher is here, Sonia, of course. Hopefully she won't change her mind after the presentation, because actually this is the first time that she hears this. So yeah, I'm disappointed. So, thank you again for inviting me. In the past, I've talked about the paratexts in the Maqamat, the titles and the commentaries associated with the Maqamat of al-Hamadani. I talked about new Maqamat that are discovered. I talked about the manuscript tradition and the different readings within the Maqamat. Today I will talk about how the Maqamat became a book. So it's books in motion. Modern readers encounter a book assuming that the author has played a vital role in its creation. They anticipate, well, rightly or wrongly, that the name prominently displayed on the cover has played an active role in the making of the book, i.e. drafting the text, dividing the work into sections, and arranging the contents. In some cases, they might imagine that the author selected the pictures, decided on the captions, and have chosen material features such as the typeface and paper. While readers know that editors and publishers often shape the final form of modern books in important ways, few would hesitate to affirm that the role of the author is central to the production of the modern book. There were authors in the medieval Arabic world who were also involved in many aspects of the production of their own books. For instance, the author may have selected the individual poems, letters, stories, or speeches. He may have considered their arrangement. He may have even made an autograph copy of particular paper and using particular ink. Alternatively, the author may have dictated the work aloud to multiple scribes and authorized them to teach the work through the granting of an ijazah, and we've heard about this in our keynote speaker yesterday. The particular features of authorial control in an age prior to the mechanical reproduction are certainly of vital concern to the students of classical Arabic literature in general and deserve greater awareness on the part of the modern students. In this lecture, I address these problems of authorship and authorial control through a particular example, the collection of the Maqamat of Badi'a Zaman al-Hamadani. Let me first introduce the Maqamat and their author, Hamadani, who is our hero for today. Maqamat is a native genre of fictional Arabic prose literature that has played an important role in Middle Eastern and global literary history. Invented in Arabic in the 4th and 5th century in eastern Iran, Maqamat are collections of picaresque tales that narrate the various adventures of a trickster's travels across cities of the medieval Islamic world. Casting the exploits and speech of its characters in flowery prose, Maqamat tales are often ironic, parodic, and darkly humorous tales which have proven themselves remarkably clever at capturing the attention of medieval audiences, modern readers, and critics. They often mock our aspects of the society and our knowledge and perception of literature, religion, science, and philosophy. Like the shape-shifting itinerant characters they portray, Maqamat works have exhibited a remarkable capacity to travel and transform. Works of the genre traversed linguistic, religious, and cultural boundaries, as writers composed maqamat collections in Persian, Hebrew, Syriac, Ottoman Turkish, and Hausa. Now, the first person ever to author a maqama was Badi' al-Zaman al-Hamadani, a scholar who would later be known during his life as the marvel of the age, Badi' al-Zaman, for his extraordinary eloquence and creative powers. Born in the year 1958 in the city of Hamadan in western Iran. He died early, he was 40 years old, and traveled across the eastern part of the Muslim world, never visited Baghdad, of course. But maqamat is the product of quotes, it's quote literature. The maqama form is made up of 5 narrative parts. First, the maqama always begins with the isnad, or the chain of transmission. So and so, the narrator told us. It focalizes the speech that follows as the order of narrator. Next comes the narrator's general introduction and setting of the scene, normally providing a geographical location. So we arrive now to Baghdad, or we arrive to Dawna. The episode of the maqama begins as the narrator encounters a mysterious person, and he interacts with this person or watches him carry out some picaresque exchange. Following this is a scene of recognition, in which the narrator is curious and eventually perceives that the mysterious figure is the trickster. The maqama concludes with the trickster's envoy, and in which the trickster reveals his wisdom, and both he and the narrator exit the scene. And this starts again in the maqama. Now, given Hamadani's role as the originator of the maqamat, he died in 398, 1008 Christian date. The maqamat of Badi' al-Zaman al-Hamadani has been the subject of a large number of articles and monographs in the field of Arabic literature. In spite of the recognized importance of Hamadani's maqamat, basic questions about the circumstances of the text's authorship, collection, and transmission remain to be answered. Indeed, it is still the regrettable common practice in studies of Hamadani's maqamat to refer to the seriously defective standard editions of the late 19th century, the best of which is prepared by the religious scholar Muhammad Abdu. And this is the edition of Muhammad Abdu, published in Beirut in the Catholic press. Abdu not only censored the text to meet the norms of a conservative Azhar audience, but also relied on later Ottoman manuscripts riddled with errors. Since the printing of Muhammad Abdu's standard edition of the Maqamat of al-Hamadani in 1889, most scholarly studies of the Maqamat of al-Hamadani have not questioned the contents of the text, believing that Abdu had altered the text in various places only for the sake of moral propriety. Most scholars have been content to read the Maqamat in this edition without reference to the earlier manuscript tradition. Relying on these defective editions not only compromises the results of modern scholars' investigations of Hamadani's text, but also prevent them from appreciating the literary culture that created this work. How were the individual maqamat composed? How were they performed? How were they recorded, lost, found, collected, and transmitted? Of course, I will not be able to answer all of these questions in this brief presentation. However, I hope to demonstrate that there is still much important philological work to be done, and I hope in the forthcoming book that I will answer most of these questions, if not all.
Sorry, repeat that again.
I was told it's very close to
I think it's a
I think it's a cell phone.
stand off.
So we're picking up, could we ask people just, when we talk, could we ask people to turn off their cell phone? It's a radical step like that.
So in the recent article entitled A Lost Maqama of Badi' al-Zaman al-Hamadani, Maurice Pomerantz and I identified a hitherto unknown maqama of medicine in the second oldest extant manuscript of a maqamat of al-Hamadani, the Yale University manuscript, Salisbury Collection 63. In this article, we discussed its possible authenticity, this new maqama, noting that because of its early preservation in the corpus, maqama Tubiya is better attested than 1/5 of the maqamat in Muhammad Abdu's edition, and urge a re-evaluation of the textual history of Hamadani's maqamat. Another article, 3 maqamat attributed to Badi Zaman al-Hamadani, provides a critical addition of 3 previously unknown maqamat attributed to al-Hamadani. The article discusses how these 3 maqamat are located in approximately 1/4 of the manuscripts of Hamadani's maqamat, including a 13th, 19th century copy of a 6th, 12th century manuscript School of Oriental and African Studies. In the present lecture, I will focus primarily on the collection of Hamadani's maqamat, in an effort to understand how the maqamat, in the absence of the author's direct participation, came to be assembled into an independent literary work. The first section of the paper surveys the earliest evidence for the circulation of Hamadani's work prior to the appearance of manuscripts. The next section considers the growth of Hamadani's collection from the 6th to the 10th century Hijri. The last section discusses how the manuscripts of Hamadani were influenced by the later tradition of authoring maqamat and collections. So, the circulation of Hamadani's maqamat prior to the oldest manuscript, which is that. The maqamat of Hamadani are works that can be read independently of one another. You can look at them as short stories, for example. Nevertheless, certain of their features lend themselves to be read as a group. The recurrence of characters, the narrative device of recognition, and the variation of the locales of action point to an author conscious of the creation of a collection. Hamadani himself refers to the maqamat of Abu al-Fatah in the plural, as if the individual maqamats acquired meaning from being a part of a presumed totality. In all probability, Hamadani never compiled his own maqamat in a definitive written collection. Hamadani's maqamat nevertheless circulated and became known to his contemporaries as works of elegant prose. Abu Mansur al-Tha'alibi, who died in 429, was a contemporary of al-Hamadani and also knew him personally. They met in Nishapur. So, Tha'alibi quotes from the maqamat of Hamadani in both his Thimar al-Qulub and his Yatimat al-Dahr. He does so, however, treating the maqamat as elegant exemplar of prose stylistic. If he was aware of the maqama as a distinctive literary form, he does not discuss this. Ishaq al-Husri also relates maqamat in the course of his compilation Zahr al-Adab. Husri is, of course, a Muqayrawan in Al-Andalus, a contemporary also to Hamadani. His quotations are far more substantial than those of the Tha'alibi. He relates 20 maqamat in total throughout the volume. So these 20 maqamat has reached Al-Andalus in Hamadani's lifetime, and Hamadani stayed in the eastern part of the Muslim world. So he was actually very well known during his lifetime. And the maqamat, of course, were very well known. Husri is conscious of the literary form of the maqamas, which might explain his attempts to suggest their kinship to a work of Ibn Yurayb. Husri relates Hamadani's maqamat in the Zahr al-Adab, much as he does other works of poetry and prose, classifying them according to the subjects which they describe, and not as components of a particular written collection. So the maqamat talks about elegy, for example, or about asceticism. He anthologizes it in that section on elegy or asceticism. So what happens later? The growth of Hamadani's corpus of the maqamat from the 6th to the 10th century Hijra. Manuscript Fatih, which we can see here, 4097, dating to 520 Hijri, 1126 Christian era, is a particularly important manuscript for the study of the maqam genre. First, it is the oldest extant collection of Hamadani's maqamat. Second, it is bound with a collection of 10 maqamat of Ibn Naqiya, who died in 485 Hijri, 1092 Christian era. The latter collection, i.e. that of Ibn Naqiya, is distinctive because it is the first maqama collection we know of to have a written introduction which identifies its author and has a uniform hero that appears in all of the maqamat. Hamadani's maqamat actually do not have a uniform hero. This is still manuscript Fatih. The most significant features of the Maqamat al-Hamadani in manuscript Fatah is that there are 40 maqamas in the collection. The number 40, as many previous scholars have stated, is suggestive of links to hadith collections. Individual maqamas can be understood as records related by one individual about the saying and actions of another. As such, the collection resembles a Muslim that contains the reports of a particular companion of the Prophet arranged according to the narration. Now, of course, Muhammad Abdu's edition has 50 maqamat, so the oldest manuscript has only 40. So manuscript Fatah presents the maqamat in an order that differs considerably from the maqamat in the standard edition. The two subsequent dated manuscripts of the maqamat, that is Sawas and Ye, also follow the same order as Fatah. The fact that both manuscripts begin with the same core of the same 40 maqamat in roughly the same order as manuscript Fatah suggests their filiation to the manuscript Fatah and to one another. So this is the Sawas manuscript. Manuscript Sawas and later Ye, so this is the Ye manuscript, this is Sawas, are also interesting in that they both contain 50 maqamat, so not 40, 50. Their growth appears to be a response to the rise in prominence of the collection of 50 maqamat authored by Al-Hariri, who died in 516. And the maqamat of Hariri were completed in 504. Hariri praised Hamadani in the introduction to his maqamat. This sparked interest in the text of Hamadani as author of the first maqamat collection. The additional 10 maqamat that we see in Sawas and in Ye come from two main sources: the so-called amusing tales, the Mulah of Al-Hamadani, and additional maqamat, or rasal. So these are works by Al-Hamadani, but different from the 40 original maqamat that found in Fatah. So what we see here is that two later manuscripts, they have the same order as the oldest manuscript, with 10 maqamat added to it. So these are, I think, 40 maqamat or 33, whatever I could fit in this monster here, and you're not supposed to read it, of course. But I want to show you what's happening here. So this is these are the oldest manuscripts. Then we have a collection of other middle manuscripts. I call them Iranian manuscripts because most of them are currently in Iran. And then the Ottoman manuscripts, most of them are in modern Turkey. And these have the same order. These follow almost also the same order with these three editions. And these have 10 more maqamat added. And the Ottoman manuscripts follow a completely different order from the beginning. It's a completely different family of manuscripts. So a large group of maqamat were added to the corpus in the 10th century: the Mirzaliya, Najimiya, Khalafiya, Nisaburiya, Almiya, Mulukiya, Sufriya, Sariya, Tamimiya, and Khamriya. So these 10 maqamat. This group includes all of the so-called panegyric maqamat of Hamadani that Hamadani purportedly composed in 383 in celebration of the ruler Khalaf Muhammad. So I categorized the manuscripts of Al-Hamadani that I found so far, 45 or something like that, into 3 families. And this is based on the order of the maqamat, by the way, not on the individual readings. So the family A is the most heterogeneous. It includes the 5 oldest manuscripts, that is Fatih, Sawas, Ye, Aya Sophia, and Paris. Then family A prime, or A1. The second family A1 includes 20 manuscripts that date from the 11th to the 19th century. These manuscripts all retain the order of Fatah. The 3 supplementary maqamat appear in half of the manuscripts belonging to A1. Then comes family B. The third family B includes 15 manuscripts dating from the 10th to the 13th century. The manuscripts in this family follow the order commonly known from the Muhammad Abdu edition. So this is Muhammad Abdu's edition. It's based on family B. And family B is almost 40% different from the oldest manuscripts. So the text that we currently read I argue is 40% corrupt. So how did the maqamat become a collection? So I will offer a suggestion today. Becoming a maqamat collection, introductions and closure. With the rise to prominence of al-Hariri's collection of 50 maqamat during the 6th century, Hamadani's maqamat began to be understood within the framework of a maqamat collection. Maqamat collections such as Hariri and that of Ibn Naqiya possessed introductions, identities of main characters, and occasionally some notion of a closure. In this section, I will consider ways in which Hamadani's manuscripts began to conform to expectations about maqamat collections. I will focus on the introduction and the closure and leave the characters to a later presentation. So introductions. Introductions were common to prose works in the 4th and 5th century. I wrote an article called The Art of the Muqaddimah, how to start your book. Thus, if Hamadani had, and in fact collected his own work, it would have been natural for him to begin with an introduction. From Ibn Naqiya onward, it was common for the author of a Maqama collection to indicate his own role in the composition of the collection in the first person in the introduction. While extant introductions to Hamadani's manuscripts do identify him as the author or transmitter of the Maqamat, the fact that he is not the author of these introductions distinguishes Hamadani's work from subsequent Maqamat collections. Of the manuscripts of Hamadani's Maqamat copied prior to the 10th century, so the oldest corpus, two preface the collection with introductions. The introduction in the Sawas manuscript is as follows. So this is the Sawas manuscript. It's not very clear, but so the text reads: هذا مما أملاه الأستاذ الإمام الفاضل أبو الفضل بديع الزمان أحمد بن الحسين الهمداني رواية عن عيسى بن هشام من مقامات أبي الفتح. So this is what the esteemed teacher Abu al-Fadl Badi al-Zaman, Ahmad ibn Hussein al-Hamadani, related from Isa ibn Hisham of the Maqamat of Abu al-Fath al-Iskandari. This is manuscript Al Sophia 423. It begins with the following introduction. هذه المقامات أملاها الأستاذ أبو الفضل أحمد بن الحسين الهمداني بنيسابور وذكر أنه أنشأها على لسان أبي الفتح الإسكندري ورواها عن عيسى بن هشام وذكر غيره أنها من إنشاء أبي الحسين أحمد بن فارس وتواتر الخبر بذلك. Of course, Ibn Faris was the teacher of Al-Hamadani. They were not always on good terms, but he was his teacher. So the translation is: these maqamat were related by the teacher Abu Fadl Ahmad ibn Hussein al-Hamadani in Nishapur, and he mentioned that he had composed them to be uttered in the voice of Abu al-Fath al-Iskandari and to have been related by Isa ibn Hisham, whereas others have mentioned that they were composed by Abu Hussein bin Faris, and the report concerning this has become widely known. The introduction to several later manuscripts of Hamadani's begin with an introduction which appears to draw upon the language of al-Hasri and Ibn Sharaf al-Qayrawani in Masail al-Intiqal. These introductions, for example, state that this is one example from manuscript in Istanbul. Of course, in Sulaymaniya now. So, Badi' al-Zaman forged Zawara maqamas which he composed badihatan extemporaneously at the close of his literary sessions, which he would attribute their narration to a storyteller he called Isa ibn Hisham, who had heard them from an eloquent man named Abu al-Fatah al-Iskandari. So, the closure of the corpus. The collection of 40 maqamat found in Fatih is the oldest form in which we know the maqamat of the Hamadani. And in some sense, the number 40, because of its associations with collections of hadith, would seem to be a plausible end to a maqamat collection. However, because of Hamadani's famed boast that he had authored more than 400 maqamat made in the course of his famed literary contest with Abu Bakr al-Khawarizmi, Both medieval and modern scholars believe that the corpus of Hamadani's maqamat was an open corpus. So he claims to have composed 400. That is, there was no one definitive collection of Hamadani's maqamat, and that the majority of his maqamat had not reached later readers. The title page of manuscript Fatih here preserves a marginal note. It's not very clear, but this is a transcription. So the scribe is not the copyist of the main text of the manuscript. So the scribe of this note is not the scribe of the manuscript, but rather provides an alternate titles and numbering in the margins of the manuscript, suggesting that he is working from another now lost manuscript of Hamadani's maqamat. Having read the contents of the manuscript Fatih, the scribe identifies the Khamriya and Tubiya as two maqamat that he has seen, which are not found among the 40 maqamat. So he says, رأيت له مقامتين ليستا هنا، إحداهما خمرية وأولها اتفق لي في عنفوان الشديدة، والأخرى طبية أولها عني الاجتياز ببلاد الأحواز، وعدة المقامات 400 قاله مصنفها والثعالب. So I have seen two other maqamat belonging to him, meaning Hamadan. The first is the Khamriya, which begins with, it happened to me in the flush of youth. And the second is the Tubiya, which begins with, I happened to pass through the lands of Ahwaz. There are 400 maqamat, as both their author and the Tha'alibi assert. As we have shown in our recent article, the Tubiya is found in the Yale manuscript, the second oldest manuscript, while the Khamriya does not appear until manuscript Cambridge, dating to 964 Hijri. So attempts to close Hamadani's text do not seem to have been definite. In the 6th century, the corpus of Hamadani's maqamat, as the manuscript Yale and Sawas seem to have grown to include 50 maqamat in the 6th century, it seems that Hamadani's collections grew in size to 50 maqamat, mainly in response to the existence of Hariri's collection of 50 maqamat. So my conclusion. Thus we can see that the maqamat of Hariri fundamentally differs from the maqamat of Hamadani in that it was authored as a collection. In the introduction to the work, Hariri states his claim to his authorship of the entire work. He publicly affirmed his authorship of the work through the first public edition of the work in Baghdad upon his completion of the 50 maqamat in 504. Moreover, the text of Hariri itself provides a sort of a narrative closure. Hariri's 50th maqama, the last maqama, the Asriya, discusses the repentance, tawbah, of the hero Abu Zayd al-Saruji, providing a definitive conclusion to the whole. The hero finished his career in the home city of the author, and the collection came to an end. By contrast, Hamadani's maqamat remained open for many centuries following his death. In the manuscript Sawas, we find the expression, this is the end of what we have found of the maqamat. هذا آخر ما وجدناه من المقامات. As if the scribe were cognizant of the fact that more could be found. For an author who had composed 400 maqamat, the possibility seemingly remained for further additions of new maqamas. So Hamadani has gone down in history as the creator of the maqama genre. Yet, I argue, he does not appear to have been the inventor of the maqamat collection. As this lecture is suggesting, ideas about maqamat collections that emerged after Hamadani's lifetime shaped his literary legacy in significant ways. Thus, the maqamat of the author known as the wonder of the age during his own lifetime could be read by subsequent generations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bilal. Our next speaker is Hala Auji. Hala is an assistant professor of Islamic art history here at the American University of Beirut. Her book, Printing Arab Modernity, Visual Culture and the American Press in 19th Century Beirut, is in press at the moment, shortly to appear with Beirut. The book presents printed books as important sites for visual, material, and cultural analysis in 19th century Beirut during a time of an emerging Arab modernity. Her research on Arabic and Islamic book production has been supported with grants and awards from numerous institutions, including the Middle East Studies Association, the College Art Association, and the Historians of Islamic Art Association.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I know everybody's thinking the organizers, but as one of the organizers, I want to thank my colleagues for making this collaboration a breeze over the past year. As some of you may know, working on such a project usually results in a lot of battles, but in this case it was not at all very, very easy, and thank you. This paper explores the visual and organizational dimensions of varied editions of classical Arabic literary works, such as Maqamat al-Hariri and Diwan al-Mutanabbi, that were printed at numerous private and state-funded presses in urban centers of the Ottoman and Qajar spheres between 1850 and the 1880s. The volumes examined today are ones that came off of presses in urban centers within the Ottoman sphere and nearby regions, such as Beirut and Cairo, as well as the Qajar cities of Tehran and Tabriz. Although, of course, there are many others. For instance, in Istanbul, Maqamat al-Jawa'ib also printed a number of these issues. But for the purposes of this particular paper, I'm going to focus on just a few regional examples. The popularity of al-Hariri's Maqamat, and to a lesser extent, Hamadani's edition, amongst an emergent print readership, certainly parallels the genre's resurgence during the 18th century, when illustrated versions of this text were being copied in large numbers. Contemporaneously, the popularity of the famed 10th century Abbasid poet Ahmed ibn al-Hussein al-Mutanabbi's collection of poetry, or his diwan, reflects an interest in philological studies of Arabic language, as well as an interest in questions of Arabic or Islamic heritage and identity. That varied editions of these texts were issued during the mid to late 19th century from a range of different presses hints at the fact that this historic literary work resonated with myriad audiences across regions during this era, particularly so intellectuals interested in translating classical texts into products of print technologies. This reflects the growing popularity of the classical literary genre during this time amongst these literary agents. In both the Ottoman and the Qajar realms, the 19th century was a period of societal reforms that extended modernization to the realm of book publishing, where private and state-funded presses proliferated to accommodate a rise in the print readership. In his views on print capitalism, Benedict Anderson famously argued that the proliferation of printing presses and the resultant commodification of print fostered the emergence of national consciousness and views of collective identity. This argument that nationalist discourse arose in direct relation to print capitalism has since been problematized. Scholarship on this subject rightly questions the validity of an argument that emphasizes technological determinism at the expense of social impetus for change. However, the proliferation of printed editions of Maqamat al-Hariri, Diwan al-Mutanabbi, and other examples of classical Arabic literature in both Arabic-speaking and Persian realms clearly demonstrates the competitive market-oriented transformation of the trans-regional publishing sphere. In the 19th century, the Ottoman and Qajar realms were notable for the overlap between printing and manuscript practices, with the former initially circulating in a market dominated by readers of the latter. By the mid to late 19th century, which saw an increasingly competitive publishing economy, printing, however, becomes a popular mode of book production. An emerging print readership's demand for literary works is evident in the varied editions of different texts produced at different presses, each of which employs different visual and organizational conventions to cater to the tastes of local consumers. For example, pictured here are two titles pages from two different contemporaneous editions of Maqamat al-Hariri. On the left, you see one printed in Cairo, and on the right is one printed in Beirut. What can be said about the visual conventions used and the reasons why they vary from press to press? Perhaps more pertinent to the themes of this conference is the question, how can the mobility of the editions of literary texts as they move from market to market, manuscript to print, and printed edition to printed edition, inform us about the differentiated attitudes towards books and their conventions in varied regional contexts? Carrying out a visual analysis of mobility, this paper considers the aesthetic and typographic products of the movement from manuscript to print production, alongside an examination of how editions of these classical Arabic works vary from press to press in different regions. To achieve this, I consider the importance of visual literacy, which is often not adequately addressed in studies that underscore the textual aspects of books and print culture. This approach is informed by scholarship that challenges the centrality of textual analysis to historical studies of books, and an interest in exploring the links between knowledge and visuality, by considering the cultural and historical dimensions of the visual form of language, one that uncovers the semiotic potential of graphic elements and materiality. With this goal in mind, I undertake a brief analysis of these two texts in their varied editions, through a study of printing methods, typographic composition, ornamental elements, and textual organization, and specifically in an examination of title pages, introductions, and marginalia or references. By seeking an understanding of the mobility of certain aesthetic conventions, this paper reveals book design traditions that are particular to different regions. In making sense of these visual choices, I argue that the lack of movement, if you will, is not informed by mere decorative prerogatives, but is indicative of the broader socio-political concerns of readers in different regional markets. Thus, these books and their graphic features are read as important markers of visual literacy within contemporaneous artistic and intellectual realms. As mentioned before, throughout the 19th century, printed books were circulating in a market that was for the most part dominated by scribal products. The printed works discussed in this paper were ones that emulated scribal traditions. When studying the layouts characteristic of this region and period, it is also evident, however, that inspirations were culled from myriad sources, both local and global. This, in turn, speaks to the truly experimental nature of printing at this time. This, for example, can be seen in the title pages of these publications. In the traditional context of manuscript production, title pages did not always include information like the work's title, author, or date. The contents of this page often varied and were frequently added to by owners after the book was commissioned. Book titles can be found in the headpiece of manuscript incipits on land pages or the title piece, which is usually a decorative panel or a page carrying the title of the work or label on a binding. Often, information related to the book's title, authorship, city of production, date, and other aspects related to the manuscript production, if this information is provided at all, could be found as scribal signing off notes or call-upons. This manuscript-inspired practice continued in examples of printed books. Seen here, for instance, is an edition of Diwan al-Tanabi produced in India, possibly in Calcutta, or a Persian market. The triangular motif contains the title and the author name, yet no publishing information is included. And aside from a few lines of poetry, the page itself is mostly left empty, possibly to accommodate the various marks of ownership. Of course, this was not unique to printing practices in the Middle East and the Islamic realms. In 15th century Europe, for instance, although manuscripts had occasionally featured an incipit folio with the book's title, the regular use of title pages and the inclusion of information previously restricted to the call-upon was mostly a development associated with emerging printing traditions. Title pages negotiated a shifting relationship between authors and the reading public, with the commodification of print being a driving force behind such developments. The publishers of early European printed books, or sometimes they're called incunabula, began including title pages to help with cataloging books, creating book lists for libraries, and advertising their presses in the content of the printed tome. In the context of Arabic printing in the Ottoman and Qajar realms, the designs and the content of title pages varied from press to press and publication to publication. In particular, some of these pages experimented with a plethora of visual attributes from a variety of sources. One such example was printed in Cairo via letterpress technology in 1882 at Al-Mutbah al-Media. An earlier edition, which looks exactly like this one, was also printed in Cairo at Dar al-Tiba'a in 1856. And one of these editions is currently on exhibit in the library, if you want to see it. These editions bear great resemblance to the products of Cairo conventions. For instance, Here, the opening page of the main text displays an elaborate composition using ornamental metal type. Both of these are also on this list. This recalls the visual conventions common to illuminated carpet pages from Islamic manuscripts, such as the example here of an opening from a partial volume of the 15th century Quran. Here's the title page from another earlier edition printed via lithography and produced at the Abbas Mirza sponsored press at Tabriz in Iran, sometime between 1856 and 1857. Books printed via lithography in Iran, as well as in surrounding urban centers like Lucknow, for example, as well as the Muslim press of Nasruddin Haidar in Calcutta, and there's Bombay and Lahore, they often employed similar elaborate manuscript-like carpet page, title page designs. For example, here's a carpet page title piece from a compilation of sayings by Ali ibn Abi Talib printed in Calcutta. That this design was created with this particular market in mind is perhaps best illustrated in a number of lithographed works from Calcutta produced for Persian-speaking readers. Of the regional examples seen, title pages printed off Beirut-based presses in Ottoman Syria most closely resemble their European counterparts. Here, for instance, is a title page from a Beirut edition of Maqamat al-Hariri printed at Matba'at al-Ma'arif, or the Knowledge Press, which was founded in 1867 by the Syrian scholars Butrus al-Bustani and Khalil al-Khoury. Although decorative elements appear on the edge, they are limited to a border framing the central text that includes the title, the extended name of the author, a few lines of poetry, the publisher's city and date. These last three features did not frequently appear on the title pages that we just saw from other regional presses. Khalil al-Khoury went on to establish al-Matba'a al-Adabiyya, or the literary press, in 1874, where he published another edition of this earlier maqamat, employing similar visual conventions for the title page design. Similar title pages are found in other works printed at privately owned presses in Beirut during this period, as seen, for instance, in this edition of Diwan al-Mutanabbi that was produced by Butrus al-Bustani prior to his establishment of his knowledge press. The title page displays the author's name, the funders, the press, city, and date, all components that clearly frame the work as a product of a specific press, thus illustrating the European approach to the commodification of print culture. Aside from title pages, two other distinguishing features of printed books that I will briefly discuss today are the introductory pages, as well as the use of marginal glosses and references. Going back to the example of maqamat printed in Egypt in 1882, the book displays the emulation of scribal conventions through the use of a rectal headpiece in its incipit pages and the addition of extra textual marginal notes. Although it was printed via letterpress, the producers resorted to a creative use of ornamental sorts, sometimes even using punctuation marks, to compose a complex sablah, or a headplate, that crowns the opening text on the right side of the page. A bismillah, in this case, an Islamic doxological phrase, is nested within a cartouche, a typical feature of manuscripts and printed books alike during this period. Also seen in this book is the inclusion of readings, references, extra textual marks. This example, like other books printed in Egypt as well as in Iran, which I'll discuss later, continue the tradition of marginal glosses or scolio, popular in regional manuscripts, which present a culmination of textual corrections, interpretations, explanations, and extra textual readings. Similar features are seen again in the example of Diwan al-Mutanabbi from Calcutta. Here we see the use of a decorative headpiece, which is hand-colored in this case, alongside the presence of marginalia. In scribal practices, the manner of adding textual glosses frequently entailed writing interlinear annotations and/or including such commentary at times, at sometimes varying angles from the primary orientation of the text. In this way, these printed elements reflect the kind of handwritten exegesis that would normally populate the margins of manuscripts. Of the examples shown today, this practice is possibly most noticeable in the lithographed edition of Maqamat al-Hariri printed in Tabriz. This particular work exhibits the intricate layers of writing created when multiple lines of marginal interpretation punctuate and interface with the body text, lending a somewhat unexpected visual dimension to the complexities of what you might even be able to call a Barthesian writerly text. The Maqamat and Mutanabi editions from Beirut presses, on the other hand, illustrate an altogether different approach to opening pages and reference notes. In Mabbat al-Ma'arif's edition from 1873, for example, the text opens to a doxological phrase, Bismillah, in a printed script that emulates its handwritten counterparts. However, there are a few decorative elements. Additionally, external references here are presented in the form of footnotes, which were common to contemporary Western print editions. The appearance of the footnotes in Arabic books at this time was likely limited to the realm of print, with manuscripts mostly utilizing marginal notes for the exegesis, although this was not the only case. For example, footnotes in Arabic historical chronicles appeared in 19th century publications as aspects of historicism became increasingly popular in history and Arabic genres during an age of modernization. Similarly, Boutros al-Bustani's Diwan al-Mutanabi exemplifies the visual conventions popular amongst a number of Beirut-based presses. While this publication also indicates a utilization of footnotes, what is particularly striking about it can be found on its opening pages, the doxological calligraphic Bismillah written in the Tughra form. The Tughra has its origins in the Mamluk, then Ottoman calligraphic tradition, where the name of the Sultan was written in a curvilinear motif. By the 19th century, this calligraphic practice became a popular element on wall panel paintings, which featured benedictions written using this visual form. Here, the Tughra is employed as the only prominent aesthetic feature, alongside a minor minimalistic headpiece border. This can be read as a remediation of past traditions, while concurrently illustrating a continuity of reading practices during the period of modernization. The question of technology and the modernization of book manufacture brings up the issue of remediation. Problematizing the a priori European ownership of technologies like print and photography, for instance, Islamic art historian David Roxburgh explains that the traditional and some contemporary perspective on these subjects, quote, turn around the perceived rupture, the break in an artistic tradition instantiated by the growing exposure to European art, culture, and technology during the 19th century, end quote. Roxburgh argues for a systematic study of examples from print culture and photography that considers the complex intersections of media and their remediation by looking into how such works were, quote, assimilated, remediated, and recast in the context of traditional customary artistic practice. Remediation in this context refers to, quote, the common understanding that successive media of representation always involve the mediation and refashioning of prior forms of media, end quote. In the case of the printed editions of Maqamat al-Hariri and Diwan al-Mutanabi that I briefly discussed today, it could be said that they continue to emulate the visual and calligraphic conventions found in their handwritten counterparts, while concurrently introducing alternative modes of textual organization and visual representation that were more in line with the technological changes in book production at the time. However, this does not adequately explain why some of the same texts printed at different regional presses were aesthetically and organizationally distinct from each other, at least in the mid to late 19th century during this period of transition from script to print. Some scholars, such as O.P. Sheglova, argued that specific regions, like Qatar, Iran, for instance, had, quote, a traditional attachment to calligraphy, end quote. She explains that with the graphic printing, where a hand-produced page layout can be directly transferred onto the printing stone, was thus more popular in regions like Iran and India. As a result, books coming off of the graphic presses in the region demonstrated more calligraphic fluidity, finer details, and more elaborate ornamentation than their letterpress printed equivalents, which had to rely on the use of rigid metal type and preset grids, the latter necessary for establishing the locations of margins and body text. In the case of the Arab and Ottoman realms, like Egypt and Syria, letterpress printing, by using movable type and engravings and so forth, was thus preferred, according to Shailova, with the assumption being that these regions were culturally more in tune with the West. However, as seen in examples from Egypt, despite the difficulty and expense of including peripheral text on diagonal lines with metal type, this technological hurdle did not necessarily prevent the incorporation of some ornamental elements in marginal notes. The fact that these presses were state-funded, and I should note here that state funding at the time was more consistent than in the case of private printing establishments. This also means that certain luxuries could be afforded in the layouts of their respective publications. The problem with reductionist arguments that emphasize technological determinism with respect to book production lies in the disregard of societal concerns and intellectual practices shaping regional understandings of the book and its uses. It was not simply a matter of technology that books printed at different presses visually translated manuscript traditions in different ways. At the same time, based on the few examples that I show here, of which many, many others exist, I would also argue that it was not a matter of common or widely communicated lexicon of readily available visual conventions or motifs that were simply randomly employed by different presses. In fact, a more systematic analysis of such books would reveal a much more complex and nuanced scenario. As a very brief indication of possible circumstances surrounding the choices behind these visual conventions discussed today, I would suggest that broader intellectual and social issues were at play. A case could perhaps be made for the Muslim-operated and state-run presses from which we saw books printed in Iran and Egypt. It is possible that a local interest in Islamic revivalism, sort of an extension of local conceptions of modernity that extended to so-called neo-Islamic aesthetics and practices in architecture and painting, were also being negotiated in the realm of publishing. Thus, rather than arguing that printed editions of Maqamat al-Hariri and Diwan al-Mutanabi from Cairo and Iran simply emulated existing manuscript traditions, I am suggesting here that these very choices stemmed from wider state and elite-driven interest in either recalling, reviving, or emulating the heritage of a past Islamic so-called golden era. This would fall in line with the Egyptian Neo-Mamluk revival, a product of both Orientalist entities and the state, and similar state interest in the revival or reformulation of Safavid conventions in the Persian realms. In the Ottoman context, however, the books we saw today were not printed at state or Muslim-operated presses. Rather, these works come off of presses owned and operated by a group of Arab Christian print intellectuals who were engaged in writing, editing, funding, and producing works within the emergent regional print industry during the 19th century. For these scholars working in the Ottoman realm, particularly the Arabic-speaking provinces of Ottoman Syria, texts like Maqamat and Diwan al-Mutanabi were part of the intellectual program of the Nahda, or Renaissance, period, characterized by momentous economic and socio-political changes in Arab regions, including modernization reforms and the growing popularity of ideas about nationhood. An interest in discourses on Arab heritage and national identity saw these Nahda period Christian intellectuals strive to situate their work within the lineage of classical Arabic writing, often by Muslim authors, in order to displace Islam's hold under Ottoman rule on these discourses. The Nahda period books printed in Beirut featured a non-traditional and almost industrial aesthetic, and their almost unadorned layouts with just mere traces of scribal conventions. I would argue that these works demonstrate interest in moving beyond the customary visual language of manuscripts in favor of a new graphic representation that incorporated Western publishing practices and contributed to an emergent modernist aesthetic. The changing visual conventions of the Arabic publications seen today illustrate how books function as dynamic sites of creative convergence that demonstrated the broader artistic concerns of this period in the Islamic world. This was a moment that saw the coming together of industrialized global modernization practices and the perseverance of local customary modes of visual production. In particular, the works discussed here illustrate the varied aesthetic manifestations that popular literary works took on and demonstrate a regional specificity where printed works negotiated broader intellectual constructs of the value and uses of books and original conventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala. I'll introduce Catherine while she's looking for her folder. So Catherine Schwartz is an Arabist and a historian of the modern Middle East. Her current research focuses on the political economy, professionalization, and intellectual history of textual production in late 19th century Cairo. Catherine is a postdoctoral fellow for the Digital Library of the Eastern Mediterranean at Harvard University. And she holds a BA in Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies from King's College, University of Cambridge, and a PhD in History and Middle Eastern Studies from Harvard University. The title of her doctoral dissertation is Meaningful Mediums, a material and intellectual history of manuscript and print production in 19th century Ottoman Cairo.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I'll join the chorus in thanking Hala, Sonia, and Jim for organizing this brilliant conference. So I will move us now to the realm of commerce. Today I'll center my remarks on an understudied site of mobility, the movement of text from handwriting to print. At the material level, this topic has been approached through typesetters' copies of manuscripts by Jan-Joos Wittkamp. In fact, this is an image stolen from him, where he shows how a typesetter has marked up a manuscript to convert it to print in a very excellent paper. But I won't speak of this shift today, but rather I wish to explore how private printers from Cairo in the third quarter of the 19th century brokered this transformation structurally. That is to say, how the process of converting manuscripts to printings worked at the transactional level, since these arrangements help to explain how many of the sources we have today came to be created. Admittedly, the topic of how 19th century Cairene printers structured their businesses is a difficult one to get at. So, for so far as I know, we don't have access to any working papers of private printers up until the end of the late 19th century. So, because of this dearth of information, people have to be creative. One way of trying to understand how printers work is to aggregate all of the texts that they produce, to plot them over time, and to try and detect patterns and changes in their output. Another approach is to search for their advertisements for services like bespoke printings in the backs of newspapers, which often list their prices. But still, these approaches don't help us to understand the process by which presses actually went about their work. So, against these alternatives, an important and rather curious text holds the only clues to how this process works that I know of. So today, I'll rely on the microhistory offered by this text for insight into how moving text from manuscript to print actually worked at a private press. So this is the title page of this text, which has a really wild title, which translates essentially to, "This is a treatise written by the lawyer Katsiki on the suit between Cavalier Musa Castelli and Sheikh Hassan al-Idli, and in it is proven that the two verdicts are faulty insofar as they are riddled with faults of transgressing boundaries, lack of fairness, and of the terms of elective legal power, requête civile, and political mediation." Now, believe it or not, this text is actually one on commissioning. It's a dispute between a commissioner and a private printer over how this negotiation is brokered. And the reason why commissioning is important is because, so far as I understand it, from my wider research, it's this process of commissioning by which most of Cairo's manuscripts were converted to print during this process. And indeed even at the governmental presses, commissioning goes on. So, the legal case that the Risala, which I'll refer to henceforth as Risala, treatise, revolves around, began when a printer took a commissioner to court to reclaim his payment for printing texts that the commissioner had not paid him for. And incidentally, have I skipped? Maybe. Commissioning is referred to either as iltizam or policia. But the printer here is Musa Castelli, who's born sometime around 1816, and he's the owner and founder of Cairo's Al-Maktaba Al-Castelliye, or the Castelli Press, and the commissioner is the Azharite Sheikh Hassan al-Idbi al-Hamzawi, who dies in 1886. Now, before I get into the details of what transpired between these two men, and what the Risala tells us about the business of moving text from manuscript to print, let me first say something about their backgrounds. Sheikh Hassan was a prolific commissioner of Cairene lithographs and typographies during the mid-19th century. Zurichli's entry for him in the Alam notes that he was a Maliki jurist from the town of Al-Idwa, that he studied and he taught at Al-Azhar, and that he died in Cairo. The entry also attributes 7 printed books to Sheikh Hassan, comprising 11 volumes. In fact, by a cursory count that I've done, he had a hand in printing at least 17 more. So he's quite involved in printing, even though he is sort of an Azharite sheikh. Now, Musa, by contrast, was a private printer, and perhaps Cairo's earliest private printer. Private printing had, of course, occurred in Egypt before the mid-19th century. Small Jewish presses printed Hebrew texts in Cairo during the early modern era, and European presses printed in European languages in Alexandria from at least the first decades of the 19th century. But instead of these two types of presses that printed for their distinctive minority communities, the tradition of printing that Musa emerges from was one that produced Arabic texts from Cairo for the literate majority, starting from the early 1850s. As I said before, little information exists about these early Arabic private presses beyond the very printings that they produced. These events that these presses expanded into print via the spaces, norms, and practices of the manuscript industry. They functioned for profit and based themselves around Cairo's Al-Azhar Mosque, the traditional center for producing formal texts. They used lithography to the exclusion of typography, the latter of which was the preserve of the governmental presses until around 1860s. Around the 1860s, when the Egyptian government actually sells its typefaces to these private printers, and that's when you see them acquiring typefaces. They usually lacked press names, as Hala pointed out, which I suspect was a reflection of the irregular nature of their work. And they operated through consortiums of people who likely took turns on a handful of lithographic stones, as opposed to brick and mortar printing facilities that housed professionalized specialists. Now, although Musa would become a part of this world, he was not Cairene by birth, and his link to Egypt began when he arrived from Florence sometime around 1832. And it's unclear where Musa learned to print, but he produced his first printing, it is said, in 1852. The 30-year lag between Musa's arrival to Cairo and the ascendance of his press, which would in fact become one of Cairo's earliest professionalized presses, indicates that he became integrated into the city's social fabric during this period. His printings were in Arabic, and they exhibited a mastery of the local corpus through titles like Al-Fatawa al-Hindiyya, Qisas al-Anbiya, and Futuh Sham. Another example of Musa's integration into Cairene society is through the sustained printing commissions that he took on from prominent local figures, mainly from Azharite circles. And Sheikh Hassan was among this group, as from at least March of 1861, he commissioned printings of texts that were authored by others, and also texts that he himself authored. Over the 1860s, Sheikh Hassan commissioned and occasionally corrected multiple texts from Musa's press. But towards the end of the decade, the relationship between these two men began to sour. And we know this, of course, because of the Risala, which Musa's press publishes in 1871 to detail his grievances against Sheikh Hassan. So obviously, told from a perspective that favors Musa, the account shows how the printer and commissioner navigated the commissioning process. And it began by describing how Musa and Sheikh Hassan possessed two very different claims to prominence, one based on the functional recognition of the printer, and the other on the deep social prestige of the popular Azharite. Musa, it tells us, had, quote, become famous in the land of Egypt and beyond in the countries of Europe through his books which were not known there before this era, except for a little. While Sheikh Hassan was, quote, one of the ulama who is himself known for being a servant of knowledge at Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo. He is a man of high station and he has a rank and standing among the prominent and the public because he is one of the few ulama who speak at the minbars of mosques in the presence of Muslims. Therefore, he became a possessor of reverence and dignity among them. The text goes on to introduce Musa's grievances against Sheikh Hassan, noting that, quote, the Sheikh had previously purchased numerous printed books from Musa that were printed on Musa's press. Indeed, he also commissioned him more than once to print numerous books and famous compositions, and this was the origin of all of the amounts that had caused Sheikh Hassan to become indebted to Musa. However, the Sheikh was not interested in paying back what was owed of him. So begins this fascinating text that blends topics, as you can see from the title, ranging from legal history to the development of civil society. If you think about the fact that here's somebody who's this printer who's not getting his way in court, and so he's going to take this to the public in order to seek his justice. But in any case, here I'll limit my remarks to what this text tells us about how the transaction of commissioning worked. Now, as indicated by the passage, Sheikh Hassan's indebtedness to Musa was complex because the men continued conducting business together throughout the 1860s despite Sheikh Hassan's outstanding bills. They came to an arrangement that included Sheikh Hassan transferring land to Musa and issuing bond notes to him in exchange for the continued printing of books. The costliness and speculative nature of the printing industry therefore linked it to other economic sectors like land ownership and banking. And costly it was. I really can't emphasize this point enough. Even adjusting for these installments that Sheikh Hassan was paying to Musa, Musa still claims that Sheikh Hassan owed him 2,564 Egyptian pounds. And to get a sense of the value, an English guidebook from 1875, so 44 years later, notes that 1 Egyptian pound equaled approximately 97.5 kirsch or piasters, with 1 dozen eggs commanding 5 to 6 kirsch, and a dragoman's daily wage fetching 5 to 7 kirsch. So to put it another way, for the amount that Sheikh Hassan owed Musa, Musa could have purchased the labor of 500,000 dragomen for one day, or 500,000 eggs. I mean, this is not a small sum. And of course, Musa very kindly itemizes this list, and he prints up all of these sort of contracts, and I've sort of moved over to a separate slide, the one that pertains to us, or the information that pertains to us. But Sheikh Hassan's alleged debt derived from a mere 6 titles that were in various stages of production. Of books already printed, he owed Musa over 175,000 kirsch, or Kitab Muslim ala al-Nawawi, 200 Egyptian pounds for 600 copies of Kitab al-Shifa, 60 Egyptian pounds for copies of Hashiyat al-Bujuri, and nearly 1,000 Egyptian pounds for Kitab Hadith al-Bukhari. Of books that Sheikh Hassan commissioned that were in the process of being printed, i.e. unfinished printings, he owed Musa, again, nearly 250,000 kirsch for Hashiyat Dasuki al-Shah al-Kabir on the expectation that this book would comprise approximately 400 choirs at the rate of 650 kirsch per choir, and 130,000 kirsch for Hashiyat Dasuki al-Assad, comprising approximately 200 choirs. So these two books that would be in the process of being printed, they are actually massive. Each choir it consists of 4 sheets of paper, which means 16 pages. So if you can imagine that there are 200 or 400 of them, these would have been multi-volume texts, and at that there would be 1,500 copies printed of each of them. So Musa sought to recoup Sheikh Hassan's debt from all of these printings, but his legal case was sparked by those last two Dasuki texts that were in the process of being printed. And the reason for this was because the upfront costs of these books were built upon approximations. It was impossible to predict exactly how many printed choirs would correspond to a manuscript text. Therefore, a commissioner at Musa's press would agree to pay the press an advance for the estimated number of printed choirs that would result from converting a manuscript to print. This would be evened out once the printing was completed and the actual number of choirs produced became known, whereupon the commissioner then owed the printer an additional fee for each choir that was actually printed. Now, this is important, again, because we're talking about huge sums of money here. So because people couldn't say for sure how many choirs would be required in converting a manuscript to print, there was an enormous margin for error, and commissioners were assuming great risk. So, for the commissioning of the 1,500 copies each of these Dasuki books, Sheikh Hassan was promised by Musa that he would use particular typefaces and paper as agreed upon from an initial printed specimen called Urnique to produce texts that were promised to be void of errors. This implies then that to convert a manuscript to print, printers would create a sample page and get the commissioner's blessing on its appearance before moving ahead. In exchange, Sheikh Hassan was to provide Musa with the manuscript texts that were to be printed. He was also to pay Musa the upfront fee of 650 kirsch per printed choir approximated, which included the costs of materials like paper and also labor like printing and correcting. Moreover, Sheikh Hassan himself was to contribute to the printing 135 reams of molded paper. Finally, Sheikh Hassan would pay Musa an additional 180 kirsch per choir printed upon completion of the work. Now, these are the details that we have on how the transaction of commissioning a manuscript for print worked. The question that arises then is how representative was this arrangement at Musa's press for all of Cairo? My sense is that it was in fact quite representative. And there are a few reasons for this, but one of the more sort of intriguing ones is because this process of commissioning that Musa employs harkens back to the way that Cairenes commissioned manuscripts. Customarily, commissioners of manuscripts supplied copyists with the text that they wanted copied. Then the copyist and commissioner brokered the terms of the project. This required the commissioner to set their expectations for the end product, and the copyist to then bargain their wage accordingly. Once the copyist and commissioner struck their deal, they took a binding oath, Yamin Morales, to ensure the realization of their arrangement. And in the 1830s, the English Arabist Edward Lane observes this process for commissioning manuscripts, recording that for 3 Cairene piasters, one could order a choir of 20 pages, quarto size, with about 25 lines to a page in an ordinary hand, but more if in an elegant hand, and about double the sum if with vowel points. And it's of note that the commissioning of a manuscript seemed to parallel that of a printing in almost every way, with the elegance of the hand mirroring the printed specimen that the printer would have to show the commissioner before moving ahead with the deal. But to return to the point that I'm making, because print commissioning seems to have developed out of manuscript commissioning, its practice among Cairene printers was probably quite widespread indeed. Yet, despite the similarity between manuscript and print commissioning, the move from manuscript to print injected a new element into the mix, that of risk. The very multiplicity demanded by the act of printing raised the stakes of commissioning text, because it required further expenditures like those of locking up paper and of storing and selling multiple copies of single texts. Having these thousands of volumes on your hands was very expensive. So we're locking that money up in paper and putting a roof on these books so that they wouldn't get wet or damaged. Thus, whereas a manuscript commissioner and a copyist would be matched one-to-one in a chain that linked its consumer to its producer directly, a print commissioner assumed the uncertainty associated with unstable demand for the many copies of text that he paid to reproduce. The agreement between Sheikh Hassan and Musa reflects this risk, for it stipulates that Musa would not give Sheikh Hassan the finished printings until he received his payment in full. This detail suggests that Musa, and perhaps other printers like him, had come to anticipate trouble in collecting their fees from clients. That it fell upon Sheikh Hassan to pick up his printings in order to sell them also highlights the fact that printers printed text, while commissioners were responsible for playing the roles that are associated with publishing, like funding and ultimate vending of the texts. Another important aspect of the agreement was its temporality, insofar as it lists loose deadlines that Musa and Sheikh Hassan are obliged to keep to. For example, the books that we see here were to take between 6 to 8 months to print, and Sheikh Hassan's payments to Musa were expected to correspond to the timing of the printing process. Now, to conclude, I'd like to set aside Musa's case, which incidentally he appears to have won at long last in 1880 after over 11 years of court battling and then sort of publishing treatises about the issue, because this sort of case is beyond the topic at hand, namely textual mobility. And I'd like to zoom out to propose 3 interrelated takeaways that arise from this microhistory about how the process of converting manuscripts to printing worked at the transactional level. Firstly, appreciating what went into Musa and Sheikh Hassan's collaboration cautions us against the notion of the fixity of textual roles. The material move from manuscript to print appears to have been an unstable one, brokered not by printers, publishers, commissioners, and writers with discrete roles, but rather by people who wore multiple hats. This was true even at Musa's professionalized press, in which we see him serving as printer and perhaps co-author and commissioner of the Risala, and in which we see Sheikh Hassan as a writer, a commissioner, a corrector, and a publisher. And it's in this mixing of roles that wider societal reputations seem really to have mattered. For commissioning to have worked at Musa's press, for example, this Italian-born Jew had to be deemed trustworthy of carrying out an enormously expensive and speculative agreement. And for commissioning to be worthwhile for Sheikh Hassan had to feel confident that he was appreciated by the public as a popular intellectual whose texts would actually be purchased. The second point is that human agency played a decisive role in determining what got printed and what did not. It played an enormous role in determining the written record that we have when it comes to printed text. People had to decide what was worth the expense and effort of printing and selling in such a costly and speculative business. And beyond that, human relationships determined whether or not these projects would be carried out. It's no surprise here, for example, that the dispute between Musa and Sheikh Hassan left the 2 texts by Ad-Dasuki that Sheikh Hassan had wanted to print in manuscript form. They were never printed. And this leads me to my final point, being that the financial stakes of printing suggests that a main difference between a manuscript and printed text during this era was whether or not someone deemed a text to be worth the risk of having it printed. Printings did not come to fruition on account of their literary merit alone. First and foremost, they were business ventures, each of which reflects relationships, constraints, and a significant amount of investment and effort in order to be moved from manuscript to print. Thanks.
So thanks very much to all of the speakers today. I have a brief response in my capacity as respondent, which I've entitled The View from Byzantium. Byzantine art brings with it an inbuilt problem, so to speak. What you're looking at over here is the Joshua Roll, a manuscript of the 10th century, so Byzantine production, the 10th century, now in the Vatican. To those of us who are art historians, perhaps the most striking thing about it is how classical it is. That is, it looks very reminiscent of art done during the Greco-Roman period of antiquity. And so actually, let me just back up just so that you get a chance to acclimatize your eyes to it. This is an illustration of the Old Testament book of Joshua. The manuscript itself is a fragment of this, and over here you can actually see over here. So that is Joshua receiving tribute from the various tribes that he's in the process of conquering. So that's this particular scene that you see over here. So there's Joshua. That's his army behind him, and this is these are the supplicant peoples who he's conquering. Now, if you compare this with Trajan's column, so over here, that's the column itself, and this is a particular scene from the column itself. So Trajan's column, it's a column of the Emperor Trajan in Rome, completed in the year 113 AD. It narrates the exploits and victories of the Roman Emperor Trajan in the Dacian Wars. And often Trajan appears in the scenes, not all the time though. It's a continuous scroll, as you can see as it rolls up over here. And it shows all kinds of detail of what a military campaign in ancient Rome looks like. So you can see people active, building fortifications, actively involved. You can see the Roman soldiers over here, crowds of people down over there. And so this in a sense is the epitome of what the classical look of Greco-Roman antiquity is all about. And the classical look, I'll say a little bit more about the Joshua Roll in just a second. So this classical look over here, actually, yes, that's what I want to do. I will compare those two over there. And it may not be immediately obvious to you, but to those of us Byzantines, those scenes look very, very similar, and I'll explain that in just a second. This similarity between them is particularly marked when one considers that between the 2nd century, so which is when the column was done, and the 10th century, which is when the Joshua Roll was done, we have the development of Byzantine art, which looks very much like this. So this is the scene that, this is the kind of style that one would most associate with Byzantine art. It's a mosaic panel that comes from the church of Agios Dimitrios in Thessaloniki, a 6th century panel. And it shows the saint over here between two supplicants, or donors as they're sometimes called. Fairly large panel in mosaic. And the distinctive thing about this, of course, as associated with Byzantine art, is the absolute flatness and rigidity of the figures. Also, absolutely frontal, no motion, no movement, but particularly no bodies. You can't really sense any bodies. It's just the drapes fall absolutely straight, absolutely flat, so no sense of bodies. So now if you take that as the lingua franca of Byzantine art, I think you will see what I mean when I say that the Joshua Roll looks absolutely classical. And particularly, I'll put them together over here, it's particularly the sense, the fluidity of movement that you capture between them. The way in which the ease of the movement that seems to be around, not to mention the three-dimensional forms of the figures themselves. And so the sense of embodiedness and the ease of movement within the forms itself, that's really distinctive, and that's one of the main reasons why we say that the Joshua Roll is classical. You can also see, just to be more technical, if you can see the way Joshua is sitting there in a twisting and turning position, that relates to this twisting, turning position of the figures over here, which technically is called contrapposto, right? So the body twists and turns on its own axes. And it's those kinds of things, which are really very subtle and quite difficult to do once you don't know how to do them, so to speak. It seems to be done with absolute accomplishment in the Joshua Road. Now, one of the vexing questions for art historians, the inbuilt problem that I just referred to, is how centuries after the demise of the classical forms, do Byzantine artists pick them up again with such ease and skill? What are the modes of transmission? On the one hand, there's an obvious answer in that the Eastern Mediterranean was literally littered with the artistic remains of classical antiquity. An artist would never have to go very far to find an instance of the classical style to copy. But equally, if the remains of the classical world were always there, why were they most often ignored? So Byzantine art is not often classical, it's occasionally classical, but not often. So as I say, this is a question, both sides of the pros and the cons of it, that have vexed Byzantine art historians for a long time. But I would like to just turn my attention to a slightly different problem in this vein, and the same problematic, relating to manuscripts in particular. As in the Islamic tradition, where multiple copies of a single manuscript are made, we find a similar phenomenon in Byzantium. Thus, to give us an example, we may take the book known as the Psalter. Now, the Psalter is a collection of Old Testament psalms, frequently illustrated. These collections of psalms are often illustrated over a period of hundreds of years. This is a painting in one of the Psalters. It's called the Paris Psalter in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And there is the author of the Psalms himself, David, in the process of singing the Psalms, which are then referenced in the book. Now, as I say, there are many different examples of these psalters, and many of them are illustrated. Now, it's also clear as you look at them that many of the manuscripts copy each other, but the copying is irregular. Thus, for example, one manuscript may have illustration ABC, another may have illustrations BCD, and yet a third may have AC and D. The manuscripts thus form a loosely associated network, which is on the one hand absolutely intriguing, yet also maddeningly difficult to pin down in terms of which ones come before and which ones come after. This, of course, is one of the chief tasks that art historians give themselves, the question of before and after. You can see already how issues addressed by the speakers in the panel are of relevance to the Byzantine tradition as well. And as I was sitting listening to the papers, I was just thinking that every so often I would see, yes, that's the case for these psalters as well. So what are the complex processes of innovation and exchange that go into the production of a manuscript that is part of a tradition, yet not enslaved to that tradition? Indeed, it makes one realize that what passes for tradition, what seems to us in hindsight like a tradition, is always being negotiated and even flexed, I would say, by whoever is operating on that tradition right now. And as we see that tradition so often hallowed in hindsight, is often a somewhat chancy affair, with so many agents alien to the original artistic production playing a decisive role. But I'd like to also mention a slightly different issue that arose in Byzantine art history at about mid-century, so mid-20th century. One of the great scholars of Byzantine art, Kurt Weitzmann, defined a new problem in relation to this loose network of manuscripts that I've just been referring to. If these psalters have overlapping but not identical sets of images, surely this implies, he thought, that somewhere further back in the recension there was an original manuscript, now lost, that contained all of those images. And this became the chief problem that Weitzmann set for himself, and for a long time for Byzantine art history, the reconstruction of those lost originals. Now, I don't want to criticize Weitzmann, who was, after all, an extraordinary scholar, and really did found the discipline of Byzantine art history and set it on the course that it is today. But the papers we have just heard today show exactly the futility of the enterprise of trying to recuperate the lost original, as it is transformed through all these later interventions. But the papers also show how the questions of art history, and history in relation to these issues have shifted, and that to me is perhaps the most significant feature of these papers. In Byzantine art history, the search for that mythical lost original effectively shut down a whole set of avenues of exploration that the current papers so well open up. So many of the factors discussed today must have been active in the case of the Joshua Law, at least, so many. In all the cases we have seen today, the afterlife of the original it turns out, is at least as interesting as the original. Indeed, we might say that the afterlife is the original itself. Thank you. And so with that, we can have some questions, some discussion of the several papers. I think there's a microphone available. Tom has a question back there.
Thank you, and I just want to point out something that I find very amusing, that all four of you have shifted places and you've taken on now the identities of each other according to your name tags. So I find that very, so you've transformed yourselves here. This probably should be directed to Bilal, because I'm interested in something that you said. This topic is totally outside of my wheelhouse, so I apologize for perhaps the ignorance of my question. But you mentioned that Mohammed, in one of the introductions, said that the author said that that these are supposed to use a specific type of voice, which led me to think that if there were to ask if there was an oral tradition that went along with these, and so then how then does the transformation from oral to printed or written affect the transmission of these?
Yeah, well, absolutely. They were written to be performed, right? There's no question about that. And even the word maqama suggests that, it's a session, basically. One stands and recites. Now, we know that in the manuscripts of Hamadani, we're told that he would compose them on the spot. Right? We hardly believe that, of course. But we know that Hariri used to perform at the end of his session, his majlis. So after a whole session of grammar, 10 minutes, they make his students laugh, and he would perform his maqamat. Sharishi, of course, tells us that Hamadani used to do, who's a commentator on Hariri, one of the famous commentators of Hariri, tells us that Hamadani used to do this. Right? But we have really no evidence for that. Unfortunately, we have to accept that this performative aspect of the maqamat of Hamadani is lost. Right? We cannot reconstruct it. But we have to also imagine him as performing in the court. Just like a qasida, or just like a poem would be performed, right? So a maqama should be understood as some sort of a poem also to be performed, and he would get money, presumably, for it as well. That's how he made his living.
Sort of a follow-up question. In different versions or different manuscripts, were there differences that could be attributed to a recording of different performances?
Well, the rhyme prose changes between one manuscript and the other, right? Some readings have better rhyme. Now, whether this is attributed to the performance, we don't know. Because even a text is performed every time when you read it loudly, right? So, we don't know.
Thank you.
Actually, perhaps we'll take the one at the back. It seems like you hear it.
Thank you. I have a question for Helen. And you spoke about two patterns for presenting manuscripts in print. One you characterized as sort of more industrial or utilitarian in its appearance, and the other was attempting to mimic or reproduce some of the older traditions of manuscript commentary. Would it be a stretch to say that these two models were offering different sort of models of print modernity at a time when in cultural life there was a great effort to grapple with the question of modernity? What is it? How do we embrace it? And so with these two models, speak to some wider issues in the assimilation or interpretation of modernity at the time of the Nahda and the era that you're speaking about?
Thank you for your question. Yes, absolutely. This is my suspicion that, I mean, you can't, the problem with this kind of research is that you really have to look at a lot of these books and try to really differentiate between the different presses and what was coming out where, and a lot of these books were also circulating, so a lot of the works printed in Beirut were also found in Beirut, and so there's access to a lot of these different types of visual conventions. But depending on the press and depending on those who are working on these particular texts, it does seem to be a way in which they were negotiating their understanding of what modernity is at the time. And you see these kinds of shifts, sometimes in the same presses. So I showed later examples from Beirut, but some of the earlier examples from Beirut originally do have a kind of more visually apparent translation of scribal practices into print. But then that gets abandoned in favor of something that is more streamlined, something that would maybe associate more closely with what we call modernist aesthetic. But I would also argue that, yes, indeed, what you see in Beirut, what you see in Iran, this is a local understanding of a particular type of what understanding what modernity is. I don't think it's a far stretch.
If I could just add to that, I mean, individual presses would play too. So Musa's press there, he's printing chapbooks like Al-Qadi wal-Harami, like the judge and the thief. He's printing Islamic corpus books. He's the one who prints James Sanua's Abu Nadara, the famous sort of newspaper, modernist newspaper. So you get the sense that that there's also like a commercial, there's this motive of targeting particular audiences.
Well, I guess briefly, the question was motivated in part because I've been doing a lot of historical reading of the Ottoman era, and it's interesting to read sort of the different Arab or Arabic understandings of the Ottoman state at the time compared to the ex post facto analyses of the Ottoman state that you find. And so there were very different sort of discourses, I think, of what modernity meant, how the Ottoman state related to that, how Arab identity was understood. And so I wonder if this phenomenon that you were speaking about sort of speaks to this larger issue as well.
Yeah, I believe it does. And you know, the example I showed, I mean, they, as Catherine points out, the specific press in play is extremely important, and who is funding this press is also extremely important. And the kind of books that I'm seeing that show this particular type of Nahda aesthetic, if you will, tend to be Christian-owned presses initially, and then it changes towards the end of the 19th century.
Thank you. Beatrice,
Thank you. Yeah, two questions for Lila. The one thing is, so I have the sort of dubious phase from this maqamat existing, as we know from history, to coming into book has some more light, being, strong on that, other than they end up in the collection, but much time later. And also, what is, because the manuscripts vary, what is the major type of variation? And I can imagine three. Is it the variation in the formulation itself? Is it addition or lack of distinct maqamas? Or is it variation in the maqama sequence? And then the question for Catherine. Very, very exciting shuffling in commercialism they're happening in Cairo. You've shown us with the price lists. I love price lists. They tell us so much about literature. Some of the book titles, which seem to me rather religious staples. And but then you also describe the battle that goes getting there, and it has reminded me a little bit of the early history of printing, which is, the grand narrative is by Owe Fab. He also describes first 100 years of great creativity, typing in error and printing in error, that. Then a collapse of the market, and then starting again with books that that sold well, so these costly types could be paid for, such as a totally old-fashioned Latin grammar that was, I think, the best-selling book. Can you see a parallel to that, a move from creativity and entrepreneurism to a more streamlined and commercially-driven process, or not?
Well, all sorts of differences right now. With there are many, of course, differences with the edition of Muhammad Abdu. We omit all sorts of things that might offend his audience, right? Including whole maqam al-shaykh, which is more or less a pornographic maqam. Now, with the manuscripts between themselves, from the early tradition and the later tradition, you find mistakes in diacritics, for example, things that the scribes couldn't read. You can think, for example, of one example, in one maqama, كان يبلغني من مقامات الإسكندري ما يصغي إليه النافور, the rebellious man. Now, in the oldest manuscript, it's الفور. So that's plural of fa'il. The ghazals would listen to it. Of course, it's a motif from the Majnun Layla that the ghazals would come and listen to her. So, of course, food became in nafur. In the later tradition, the Ottoman tradition, it becomes nafur is hard to digest, so it becomes al-wa'l al-nafur, right? The beast. Right? So this is an example of the change. Now you can find endings of certain maqama appearing somewhere else. Right? So there is a shift in the endings of the maqama. So for example, the ending of al-maqam al-basriya is the ending of al-mawsiliya, and vice versa. You find, for example, more poetry in the endings. The maqam al-isfahaniya, in the addition, in the Ottoman, for example, tradition is missing 3 lines and 2 lines from prose, which completely changes the ending. Of course, certain readings change the interpretation of the text, right? And yeah.
And the book, how it has been turned into a book, there's no more additional information than the manuscripts turning up.
Well, everyone copies Muhammad Abdu. Right? All the other editions, they just plagiarize Muhammad Abdu, more or less.
Right, but before we know from history that there were apparently 20 maqamat, and then a long time we hear nothing, and apparently Hamadani never publishes them in lifetime, and then again there's long time nothing, and then the manuscripts show up.
Exactly, and they keep changing.
Okay,
In the manuscripts themselves.
so we still don't know more about that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, you will enlighten us on it.
I would say, speaking specifically of Cairo in the 19th century, it seems to be sort of two questions that determine the trajectory of the types of printings that are produced. Firstly, who's doing it, and then also changing notions of what the idea of printing is. Developed totally separately within the Ottoman example. It's sort of considered to be a fine art form, which could be used to prevent texts that represent already a great society, to prevent these texts from sort of falling away to destruction. Whereas in Europe, in the 18th century, you see printing being associated with enlightened societies, being a marker of civilization. The Ottoman conception of printing from the very beginning, it says that printing, it enhances our already great society, and it sort of evolves from there. So in terms of Egypt, when it comes to the state prints what it likes, and often these are really functional, dry texts about veterinary sciences, for example, or engineering part 2, or even sort of lists of the horrible punishments that will await peasants if they sort of deviate from particular state standards of cultivation. Within the private sort of press that emerges, there's a real there's a real sense for a while that you print what you already know will be a bestseller. There's a real conservatism. You go back to the classics, not because you necessarily think that these are the things that ought to be printed, but because you don't want to take a risk on some unknown author on sort of this new thing. as these presses become more professionalized, start accruing their own wealth, they stop taking commissions, and they themselves start either printing their own newspapers, their own sort of people, or they'll begin to print authors, and these will be smaller texts. By contrast, the state, which then begins showing its printings in Europe at like universal expositions and things, and building the Hadibio library, the state all of a sudden takes it upon itself to sort of codify the Islamic canon through printing. And so it's in like the 1870s, 1880s that you get these vast printed editions of these canonical works. So different sort of things are happening
very,
at
very
the same
different
time.
situations. So,
Yeah.
so the commercial printers become from being very commercial to then more diversified and enterprising.
Right.
So it's the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Actually, we have a question before we get to Prokop.
Thank you very much. I have sort of a follow-up question to Jim Rayleigh's, and it's also directed at Hannah, because I was struck by the frontispiece of the Diwan al-Mutanabbi from Calcutta, which carries a stamp from the Maktab al-Umumiyya of Khalil al-Khoury here in Beirut, and apparently ended up in the Weimar Library in Harvard. And I wonder whether you can tell us more about the particular movement of these particular material artifacts from Calcutta being sold in Beirut, apparently, and ending up in America, and whether it elucidates something about the book trade and the sort of artistic traditions that come with it.
You mean the book trade during this particular period in the context of Khalil Khoury? I mean, Khalil Khoury, before even starting up the Rome Press and many others, they were very much already involved in purchasing a lot of books from different presses. It's, I mean, how it ends up at the Widener, I'm assuming, either missionaries or other ways of travel. I'm not entirely sure, but the thing is, in the context of Ottoman Syria, which is what I know most about, I know that at the earliest presses, which happened to also be missionary presses, that there were a lot of collections and purchasing of texts from regional presses as they were setting up their own presses. So the mission here purchased a lot of books from Buda. They purchased a lot of books from Iran. They didn't really use the same standards when they were producing works, but they had them within their collections. Sometimes if they had a lot of works or editions from different presses, they might actually sell them as well. I'm not entirely sure how. It's interesting to consider that question, and I was thinking about it looking at that particular page. But this is what's really interesting about this, is that these texts are extremely widely circulating amongst these scholars, even before they decide to fund their own presses or start their own presses. In the case of Khalil Khoury, he was in touch with the American press very early on when they started to develop their typeface, asking for an edition of their typeface to publish his own works. And I want to actually go to a point that Catherine brings up, and this idea of the transition from sort of entrepreneurial to a private presence. A lot of what I found with a lot of these Nahda scholars, if you want to call them that, they had an idea about what they want to print before they set up their press. And it's not to reprint a classic. It's to print a classic with their name on it and their as editor, and framing it within their own, sort of like Nasif al-Yaziji in his first ever publication, printed in the early 1830s. He called him Sheikh Nasif al-Yaziji before anyone even knows him really in that context. And Busrat al-Zani did the same thing, and so it's interesting to consider that when it comes to these particular presses in the region. I mean, I know it's not your question, but I thought it would be something that would be relevant.
But as a direct follow-up question, do we know of an edition of the Diwan al-Mutanabbi printed by Khalil Khoury after he had received the copy from Calcutta? This sort of transmission would be highly interesting.
Yeah, that would. I mean, the Mutanabbi that I showed, I mean, it's not Khalil Khoury's, was not the earliest edition. Bustani's edition is one of the earlier ones. And what's interesting about this, and I didn't discuss it in the presentation because it's actually something I write about in my book, and many people might contest it. But the press listed as the Matba' Suri. But at this time, Matba' Suri was not officially active. And my theory is that based on the visual aspect, the materiality, this was actually printed at the American Press at a time when the press had become more of a secular publisher where they were taking on a lot of job work. And so it's interesting to think about how even before the Matbaa Asliya was actually conceived as a physical entity, that there are these ideas of how they want to frame and with an FB. You know, how Qutuz Bustani was thinking of framing, how Khalil Khouri is thinking of framing editions of these books.
And just to complicate this sort of we don't know thing even more, when it comes to Calcutta, Goldziher reports on Castelli's press, as admitted by one of Castelli's sons, that they lie about where their printings are made. So sometimes they claim that it's in Istanbul, for example. And I was really struck by, it's a lithograph, right? That looks very Egyptian to me, that lithograph. And I really, so I've seen instances where texts go to South Asia and the lithographer does a very good job of copying the format to sell there, because they are in fact printed there. But I also wouldn't be shocked if some of these dealers aren't saying that it's printed somewhere, but it's not.
No, it's a good point. I mean, I also, for the Calcutta edition, the one I saw, Widener I saw first, with the colored headpiece. But there's also an edition at the British Museum, the British Library, that is not colored. And in there, the British Library, Widener doesn't provide the publisher. The British Library does. So it's in any event, you know, it could happen in Egypt, you know, but.
Okay, so for the last question,
Well, thank you very much for I should say four very interesting presentations. This question is for both Hala and Catherine. I think Catherine touched a little bit on this. I'm just curious whether you have thought or come across factors that could complicate or make the narrative, both with respect to the aesthetics of presentation or the commissioning and the audience, whether we would bring in the serialized press, I mean the magazines, the series, etc. Would that change the story? I mean, the reason why I'm asking this is that it seems that with the press and the magazines, you have a clearly modern audience. And therefore, maybe the back and forth between, you know, emulating the manuscript tradition or the Western tradition could go either way, back and forth. So, do you see parallels? Do you see differences in terms of aesthetic presentation for Hala and in terms of commissioning and what gets published and who is addressed for Catherine?
Well, I have begun looking at periodicals for their materiality very recently. It seems to be different. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with manuscript conventions when it comes to the aesthetics. There's a lot of experimentation in some of the earliest newspapers or journals. But in the case of the periodicals that appear in Beirut, they look very much like the printed books that are, you know, larger format books that appear in Beirut as well. I mean, I haven't done a lot of work on that yet, but it's something I'm not sure that's exactly the connection. I mean, I don't think there's that link anymore. It's not that visually evident, if you will. But
I would say that serialized press. So first of all, it seems to come about, at least in Cairo, at first from commission. So I mentioned Abu Nadala beforehand. In terms of what it seems to be, but then it changes after like the 1880s or so, maybe late 1870s, and certainly into the 1890s. You begin to see serials with their own presses, like Matbaa Al-Munal, or Tanqid, Taqid, in Alexandria, that would have its own press. So one gets the sense that the more successful a serial becomes, it sort of gets its own specialized press. In terms of sort of the earlier phase, though, of sort of what changes with serialization, one thing that you see is that there's a real need to begin advertising. And sometimes the authors of these serials say things that are he must be wise. Like, oh, there are at least 15,000 readers, of this. And sometimes, historians will take them at their word. In fact, like, no, that's probably just not possible at all. The other thing that you begin to see because of this sort of financial impetus is that within serials, authors begin to claim to speak for the public. So you, dear reader, and all of these other ones who read me, you are on the right side of society, and everybody else is somehow wrong. And I think that this urge comes from this impulse to make people want to feel that, oh, I have to buy this and be, part of this conversation. And that's very much a departure from sort of the printed books and chapbooks which come beforehand.
Okay, thank you very much. So thanks to all of our speakers.